Thanks for joining us on Not Boring CEs, where we don't think you should be bored to death while getting your continuing ed. Keep listening here, then hop over to notboringces.com to get all your online CE credits. All right, y'all, let's get to learning. Elizabeth Gillette, LCSW, is an adult attachment specialist. In her therapy and coaching practices, she's supported clients for over 13 years in developing secure ways of relating and improving their relationships by breaking old patterns and establishing healthy connections with integrity. She's the author of Attachment Theory Workbook for Couples. Elizabeth believes in the healing power of connection, community, long walks, and warm cups of tea. She lives in Asheville, North Carolina with her family. You can connect with her on Instagram at elizabeth.gillette. You can also visit her website, elizabethgillette.com, for more information about attachment healing and healthy relationships. Welcome, Elizabeth. I'm really excited to welcome Elizabeth Gillette onto Not Boring CEs. We're going to be talking about attachment and how your attachment style, your attachment issues, your attachment beautifully strengths, like, I don't know, how those impact how things go in session with your clients, and ultimately your relationship with your client. So I want you guys to find Elizabeth. She's over at heirloomcounseling.com and she's at elizabethgillette.com. The first is her therapy website and has lots of great blog posts and great information. And the second is her consulting and mentoring website that also has great info. So Elizabeth, thank you for being here today. I'm really excited to dive into it.
Yes, me too. Thank you so much, Allison. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah. Well, let's start at the very beginning of attachment. I know I don't want people listening who are like, I know what attachment is. I don't want them to be like, oh, is this what the whole podcast is going to be? No, it's not. But we want to give the people who are less familiar, who think they have an idea, but they're wrong. We want to give them a better idea of what we're talking about when we talk about attachment.
Absolutely. And I think that there's a lot of misinformation out there in the world about attachment. So I think it's really good to kind of start at the beginning and give us a new foundation for it. So and I will also say this is my perspective on attachment, right? So my experience with it is the degree to which a person feels comfortable engaging in relationships, in communication, in intimacy, and conflict. And the way that I think about it is that we're looking at this on a continuum, right? So this idea that there's avoidance at one end and anxiety at another end, and we're looking at the interactions between those, and those are essentially what shape your attachment style. So there are 4 primary attachment styles, and we can kind of go, would it feel helpful to go over each of those?
Yeah, let's do a quick debrief on each.
Okay, cool. That sounds great. So the first attachment style that we'll talk about, which is kind of what we're all sort of going for, is secure attachment. And when we talk about secure attachment, we're talking about being able to feel safe in your world and in your environment, feel grounded in your interactions and your communication with other people, and be able to navigate the waves of emotion that undoubtedly happen in life and feel like you can sort of stay stable throughout those things. So in this style, there's quite a bit of consistency and predictability in how people are going to show up. And that doesn't mean they don't have feelings or that things don't ever get hard, but that they are really able to, mostly navigate things with some degree of ease. Mm-hmm. So secure attachment is what we're all going for because we really want to feel more stable in our relationships. And with the other 3 attachment styles, you'll see that there's some instability throughout. And we call these styles the insecure attachment styles. And I also just want to be really mindful and compassionate of how what judgment we bring to these styles, because we come by our attachment styles totally honestly. And our early life interactions really shape how we feel about the world, which makes a lot of sense, right? That how our caregivers interacted with us and what we learned about relationships gives us, that really shapes our perspective when we are adults. So the next attachment style that we'll talk about is anxious attachment style. And this is really more externally focused. So people who have the anxious style are often very attuned to what's going on around them and what's happening in their environment. So they are the people who are going to pick up on like, is this person mad at me? Or like, I saw that this person made this face, or when I said this, they kind of, just this very quick look on their face. And now I think maybe they're mad at me or they're upset or whatever, right? So like very attuned to what's happening in their external environment, very sensitive to any sort of conflict or anything that arises in that way. Definitely a fear of abandonment in relationships, people, this person's going to maybe break up with me, or this person doesn't actually want to be my friend, or this client doesn't actually want to be here. They're not really enjoying the work that we're doing. And this happens because of early inconsistencies in relationships. So they may have had a caregiver who was present some of the time emotionally, and then other times was very distracted or overwhelmed. And so people with this style maybe weren't sure that their needs were going to be met.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the anxious style. The avoidant style is on the other end of the spectrum. So this style is a lot more internally focused and wanting to maintain a sense of independence and comfort via distancing, right? So they can shut down when they're feeling really emotionally overwhelmed or when there's a lot of intensity in the environment. And I would say that this is maybe one of the more misunderstood styles, because I think that there are assumptions that people with this style are wanting to shut down or wanting to pull away or not wanting to engage in relationship. And I don't find that to be true. I think that really what's going on is they may not have this sort of emotional scaffolding, right, to be able to stay present in relationships that are feeling really intense. So I like to just clarify that in the beginning. And people who have this style may have grown up with some harshness in their early relationships, or focus on doing and excelling, or even having their boundaries just violated repeatedly by their caregivers or adults in their lives, where they didn't feel like they were able to have spaciousness. And so they feel very strongly about needing to set those boundaries in their adulthood. And then finally, the disorganized style, which is also called fearful avoidant. And so in this style, we see a very strong push and pull dynamic. So we also call that approach avoid. And the way that we characterize that is, like, I love you, but I'm afraid of you, right? So we see this interaction between our attachment system and our survival system. And when those things are at odds with each other, it makes it very complicated to be in relationship when you are naturally wired for connection, and you're also naturally wired to keep yourself alive. So this style, we see a lot of like unpredictability in how folks relate when they have this style. And, they can look kind of erratic in relationships, where maybe like at one time they're really wanting closeness, and then they totally shut down and pull away, and you might not hear from them for a while. So there are a lot of fears around safety and this just like general unpredictability in whether or not their basic needs will be met.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm struck as you describe all of these is like, I can hear and feel like the deep empathy for each attachment style. Like, I think about the way that different attachment styles are talked about, just like in passing, right? Hopefully not in training, hopefully not amongst groups of therapists, but I definitely think about the dismissive ways, like, oh, she's just so needy, she's anxiously attached, or oh, he's just like avoidant attachment, like he never follows through with like the connection that I need. And also just thinking about how opposites often attract and how tough that can be for people in relationships.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, absolutely. And I think too, so there are two things I want to name in what you just said. One being that our attachment style and styles, because most of us have multiple attachment styles that are activated depending on what relationship we're in, those styles are fluid, right? So like, it's even, I hear it all the time, right? And sort of like pop therapy, right? Where it's like, oh, well, that person is avoidantly attached. And it's like, well, it's not just about it's not just like a label you have out in the world. Like your attachment style is fluid. So it depends. You have to be in relationship with someone else in order to have in order to have that style, if that makes sense. So like we can't just apply a label in that way. We can say, oh, I tend on the anxious side, or I tend on the avoidant or disorganized side, but it's not just something we have. It's like something that happens that when we're in relationship with someone else.
Mhm.
And okay, I'm losing my track of thought or train of thought. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I think it's really important that we are understanding that there's also a style that happens for us as therapists, right? That we are bringing to our practices, and that we can activate our clients' different attachment styles too. I know we're going to talk some more about that, but
Mhm.
being aware of that, right? So like having our own understanding of how we show up in relationship is super, super important in terms of us doing our best in our therapy practices and in our sessions.
Yeah. And if we're going to talk about this as we go forward, we can put a pin in this question, but I am curious if like, since our attachment styles are fluid, can some clients trigger the more avoidant attachment within us versus others trigger the more anxious attachment?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes. And I think that's worth having like a whole conversation, or like, engaging in like a full question about, because there's so much in there, and I want to support folks in like having some guidance around how to know that that might be happening, and then like what to do next.
Yeah, love it. Okay, cool. Can we talk some about how our own like personal relationship history ends up showing up in session? Can we start diving in there?
Oh, yes, definitely. So the way that I think about that, when I think about, whether we are working in an already established practice or we are like building our own practice, we are really we're bringing our relational history with us, right? And that's like in how we describe ourselves, in our about, right? Like on our about page, in our, all these different things, even like how we want our photos to look, or what, like all of those things I think are really important in understanding like this is the sort of like image that I'm wanting to bring, or this is what I'm really wanting folks to know about me. And some people are going to be a lot more sort of like protective of their personal details or information, and then other people are going to be a lot more transparent about like, oh, I've been through this and this and this, and this is, I'm bringing this background and this information with me. And so I think that being able to kind of look on that spectrum of like, how transparent do I want to be? Where do I feel comfortable? What feels in alignment for me is really, really important. And I think too that there is this piece in understanding that like we are going to be triggered in our sessions with our clients. Like there's no way around it if we are bringing our full selves to our sessions. And so to be able to understand and make connections for ourselves and understand our own attachment styles so that we can say, oh, wow, like when this person canceled last minute, I took it really personally, right? Like this is about me, or this is about like they don't actually want to come in and see me, or they don't like what we're doing or whatever. I think that there's something in there to be able to say like, oh wow, I'm finding myself feeling like this is super personal, and it's okay to have all the feelings, right? Like that's completely welcome. And for us to be able to kind of assess like what is coming up for me, and how can I feel a deeper sense of security around who I am, right? How I'm showing up, and that there might be something going on for my client, right? And that like we're both having our own sort of relational stuff arise, or they just had an emergency or whatever is going on. But I think that there's that piece too that we really need to understand and be aware of our own attachment styles, so that we can have a deeper understanding of what's arising for us in our sessions and outside of our sessions.
Yeah. Yeah. How would you recommend people start that exploration? If like you
Mhm.
just said, kind of like tickled somebody's brain, maybe they've
Mhm.
read a book on attachment, but they haven't done deep training. Um, where do they start with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that there are definitely some really good books and information out there that you can start to dive into. I know I sent you a couple that will be resources that are available for folks. One of the things I do want to say is that I think it's important. This is a little caveat about, reading about these things, is that um, people who write books and present information also have their own attachment styles and their own relational history, right? So, for example, there is a very popular book out there, which I don't know if I'm allowed to say it or not, but there's a very popular book out there about attachment styles. And to me, it feels very clear what the author's attachment styles are, because they do not bring that compassionate perspective to all of the styles. And they've actually since writing that book have said that they wish they had done it differently, because they really brought in their own sort of like internal biases. And so I think that there's something in there too about, if you're reading about something and you're finding yourself saying like, wow, this doesn't quite feel balanced, or it doesn't quite feel, or I'm feeling really activated in this, there might be something in there for you about, checking into not only the resources that you're, digging into, but also your own sort of internal responses and what it might mean if you're feeling super activated. So there are some really good books out there. I love Diane Poole Heller's work. She has a book called The Power of Attachment that I think is super thorough and wonderful. And then Sue Johnson is a therapist, and she has a book called Hold Me Tight, 7 Conversations for a Lifetime of Love. And that's another really beautiful one, especially to kind of examine the relational piece. And then I hope it's okay to say that I also have authored a book.
Yes, of course.
Okay, called Attachment Theory Workbook for Couples. And so mine is a lot more focused on, engaging with these exercises to dig in and really get a deeper sense of what your attachment styles are, and how those show up for you in your relationships.
Got it. And I think about how we all want to believe that the way that we grew up with our parents, and maybe getting our hearts broken along the way. And we want to keep all of these things really distinct from the therapist that we show up in the room as. So I think what I'm hearing from you is that's not going to be kept completely separate. And maybe that's okay. Like, maybe that's just something to be aware of, something to make sure you're on top of if you think there's a chance that it could be harmful to your clients in any way. But that we can't not show up as ourselves and have that with us.
Definitely. Right. Because they're not separate. And I think that's part of what I've learned over, the 13 years I've had my, license and been out practicing in the world, is that we aren't blank slates. Like, that's not how we can't show up that way. And I think that especially when it comes to attachment work, we shouldn't show up that way, because that in itself is so triggering, right? Like, so many people have had the experience of going in and meeting with a therapist, and they're just like nodding and they're going, and you don't know anything about them. You don't know any of their background or their history. And you're just like, I have a hard time relating to this person, right? And that to me is like our attachment systems, our healthy attachment systems coming online saying, I need something to kind of hold on to here, right? Like, I need something to connect to. And so I think that when we are able to really show up as the healthiest version of ourselves and the most aware version of ourselves in the therapy room when it comes to attachment styles, we are providing our clients a gift, right? Because we're able to say, like, I'm going to show up as securely as I can for you, knowing that I'm going to, occasionally I'm going to have my own stuff arise. And I'm committed to not only addressing that personally, but also working through it with you. So like seeing our therapeutic relationships as true relationships, right? That deserve the time and energy of understanding rupture, of understanding repair, and of being able to come back and say, wow, like our last session felt kind of off to me. And I'm curious about how that landed for you. And I'm wondering like what we might need to do together to help repair so that we can move forward and feel like our relationship is clean.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious how it looks. Like, let's take anxious attachment first. If you have a like leaning towards anxious attachment therapist and a leaning towards anxious attachment client, what are some of the potential ruptures or damage done? What could happen? What do you see when you're working with therapists and mentoring them?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So in a case like that, with the sort of like anxious on one end, anxious on the other end, oftentimes we might find this sort of, what's the right way to say it? I want to be mindful of my languaging, but um, this like very deep resonance that happens between two people, right? Which is super wonderful. And we also have to be mindful of boundaries, right? And that's part of our job as clinicians, is to make sure that we're the ones holding the boundary. And I think that it can be tricky in moments like that, where you hear your client, and I think many of us are guilty of this, right? You hear your client say something and you're like, oh my gosh, like you feel this sort of like pull to kind of relate really deeply. And so I think that that's a thing that can happen, is that we can all of a sudden start to see this connection forming that's kind of beyond what we would want for a therapeutic relationship. So we just need to be mindful of that. And again, I think that there is so much beauty in mindful self-disclosure. And we also don't want to make our client's therapy session about us because we hear them talking about something that feels super relatable to us.
Right, right. And what about avoidant attachment and avoidant attachment?
Mm-hmm. So in that, yeah, in those situations, what's so interesting to me is that oftentimes, and this is not to say that no avoidant relationship would work, but oftentimes there's a challenge in making connection. So you might see, like, if you're somebody who leans more toward the avoidant side, and then you have a client who's more on the avoidant side of things, it might be kind of like, it might be difficult to create that sense of connection and be able to create, that like positive regard with each other. There might be some like holding back. There might be some, you know what I mean? And oftentimes relationships like that don't move forward because there's not that kind of like spark of connection between them. So oftentimes we need somebody who's willing to kind of create a sense of vulnerability, or create like that very first kind of step, and be the one to kind of go out on a limb and say, like, okay, like here's our thing to talk about, or here's what I want to bring to this. So I think that we can see that kind of feeling like, gosh, that didn't feel that great to me. There wasn't really anything happening between us, right? So we might not see that kind of unfolding of the therapeutic relationship in the way that we might want to.
Okay. Is it like erroneous thinking that a client leaning more towards avoidant is going to be maybe more contained in general in session, and maybe you need to help pull them out, help them with like identifying and feeling the feelings, whereas a more anxiously attached person is maybe more, I'm thinking about this from an eating disorder lens, right? Whereas like the anxiously attached person may need help containing.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And I think what you might see, and this is something that I love that you brought that up, because I think that this is something in terms of us supporting our clients and understanding and identifying their own attachment styles. Like if you have a client who comes in and they are just super, super verbal, right? And they're kind of like, you ask them a question, they're like, da, 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 and you're kind of like, I can't even get a word in here. I'm having a hard, like the whole session is just sort of like venting or dumping. You might be experiencing some of that, right? Where they really do need that kind and gentle, but firm support of like, hey, it sounds to me like there's a lot coming up for you right now. And I'm wondering how I can help support you in structuring this session so you really get your needs met. And I think that there's something too in saying something like that, where, I'm definitely on the anxious leaning end of things. And someone saying that to me is like, oh, that's such a relief, right? That you are willing to hold that with me. And I think that for people who maybe are on more of like the avoidant or even just like reserved end of things, to have a therapist who's not just going to sit there in silence. Not to say silence is never helpful, but who's not going to just sit there and make them feel more and more and more uncomfortable, right? Somebody who's going to say like, I'm curious, like, where do you want to start? What would feel good? And maybe we can even just start by talking about something as simple as this, or tell me about your work, or tell me about the last vacation you took, or so you're just like, you're helping to build in some of that support because you understand what the needs are in each of the styles.
Right. So I'm thinking, as somebody who helps people build private practices, in my other business, I'm thinking about how attachment style impacts how you build your practice. You'd mentioned earlier, like the photos you choose, the words you use, the stories you choose to tell on your website, all informed by your attachment style. What is like, I imagine that I could just like show you a bunch of websites and you could be like, yep, probably this, probably that. What are some things to kind of help soothe somebody trying to build a practice and marketing materials and struggling to do so? I know I keep choosing both anxious and avoidant and not the mixed attachment. And we should probably include that because it's probably not just a mix of the answers. Can we talk about those three and how to think about how much you share on your website or what your picture looks like?
Absolutely. So yes, I think it would be such an interesting study, right? To go through and say like, oh, I wonder what's happening for this person, or, what their styles are, or what their sort of goals are in terms of what they're showing the world, right? And I think that, some of what I've seen for folks, depending on their attachment style, is like for people who are more on the avoidant side of things, like they might kind of bury their head in the sand a little bit in terms of like their practice, or when it feels overwhelming, you see this sort of like shut down, or this feeling of just being like, and I remember this from when I was building my own practice, right? Of just being hyper focused on all the things and kind of being like, oh my gosh, what's going on? I need to check my bank account. I need to check the website. Did anybody email me? Right. And this sort of feeling of like, I need to constantly be doing. And I think too, that for the disorganized or fearful avoidance style, it's that feeling of like, you might feel super excited about it one day and then kind of like terrified the next and be like, oh my gosh, I'm not ready for this. I don't feel good about this. And all of those things are demonstrated in how you show up in your business and how you show up with your clients. And so being able to understand that, yes, of course, like your relational history is kind of coming through no matter what you do. And what I think is so beautiful about that is that every client needs someone who has one of those backgrounds, right? So that they can feel understood and seen. And kind of like you talked about in the beginning, you said, oftentimes opposites attract. I think that is 100% true, especially when it comes to attachment, and that we often choose relationships that feel similar to us as like our early relationships. And so we might be seeking somebody out who we might feel anxious, but we might be seeking out a therapist who is a little bit more reserved or a little bit more on the avoidant end of the spectrum, because there's something for us to work through in that. And I think that is the piece that's really important here, is like, as a clinician, if you can understand these different components, then you are going to be aware that there is some patterning that's being worked out that doesn't actually have to do with you, but that you are able to support and help shift for this client.
Yeah, it's kind of like a corrective experience, like, but under the surface, because it might not even be something you're talking about. It's just the fact that they were able to be helped and supported by somebody who reminded them of their dad, or, their relationship with their dad. Yeah.
That's it, 100%. And I think too, that it's kind of like, you will see clients kind of acting out those old behaviors to see if they're going to get a similar response, right? So like, if they ghost you, And then they come back and you're like, no, absolutely not. Like, you can't, you know what I mean? Like, you, you didn't show up when you said you would, blah, 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 rather than saying like, hey, talk to me about what happened. Like, I want to know so I can support you better. I'm curious about how we can create some accountability here, or how we can, you know what I mean? To make sure that this feels like a good fit for you and a good fit for me. So we're not just like totally abandoning our own boundaries. But we're able to say like, I want to meet you here, and how healing that can be for clients, that they're not receiving that same sort of like punishing response. And that's one of the things I think, like, as we talk more about this, about how, we can create more security in our practices with our clients. That's one of the things, right? Is to understand there might be something being played out here. And what we don't want to do is play into it in the way that um, they're sort of like looking for, right? Like, we want to offer something that feels different and more in that secure realm.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about therapist Facebook groups, which we know are for the most part terrifying places to be. But I'm thinking about responses to things like, my client late canceled or no showed, and I'm struggling with charging them the fee. And how you have people who are like, well, I mean, like, did they have a good excuse? Can you give them a freebie? Can you, like, playing into that? And you have the people who are like, absolutely not. You charge them the full fee the second minute that they're late, like, and just how those are probably reflected within those attachment styles and don't have anything to do with the actual relationship of the asker and the client.
100%. I think that is a perfect example of how this shows up, right? And to be able to question and check in with ourselves, if we have a very harsh response to something, or we feel super activated in our bodies, it's like, oh, there might be something coming up here for me, and it's my responsibility to check that out, right? And when I mentor therapists and coaches, that's part of what we're working on, is exploring, like, wow, I had this really strong internal response to this person like late canceling, and I immediately told them like, no, you will pay the fee. This is what it is. There are no freebies. There are no, and I'm kind of like, tell me about a time when you were treated harshly.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, is that something that you experienced in your family of origin? Is that something where you didn't feel like you had any flexibility, right? In terms of just being human, because we're all bringing our humanity with us, whether we're the client or the clinician.
Right.
And if we're not allowing space for that, there probably is something happening. And I think that's true too for the folks who never charge a late cancel fee, even if their client has no showed like 5 times, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're just like, well, I just don't feel good about it. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, there's something happening there too around like, what's going on for you that you don't feel like you're able to assert yourself and recognize like your worth and your time and the importance of those things. So it's kind of interesting to consider that all of these things are different aspects of, our relational history.
Absolutely. And I also want to clarify that it's not that you bend your policy to the client necessarily, but I think there's a difference between like your example of like, absolutely not, you are paying right now, and totally get it. As discussed in our first session, I'm going to charge you the no-show fee, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you next week.
Yep. Absolutely. Right.
Like,
Like, this doesn't impact it. Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Like, we're still connected. We're still good. Right. Rather than being like, you need to think about what you did. Right. Like,
Right.
because there's an element of that sometimes. And I see it too. And the therapist groups, like you're talking about, where people are like, oh my gosh, I'm so behind on notes. Right.
Mhm.
And people are like, oh my gosh, that is totally breaking, you know what I mean? Like, your contract with the insurance companies, and no, rather than being like, wow, it's like, have you never missed a note? Have
Like,
you
we've
never
literally
behind?
all been there. I don't believe anybody who says they've never fallen behind on a note. Or if I
No.
do, it means they've got an issue with rigidity.
Right, right. Well, and that's what I mean. Like, there's something in
Yeah.
there for us to explore. And I don't mean, I'm not trying to harp on the people who are more like rigid, but to be able to say that there's something in here for us to check out, right? Like, it's an invitation for
Yeah.
us to get to know ourselves better and recognize that like that reaction or response that we're having if it feels like it just comes out of nowhere and it's like, this is what I do, rather than being thought through and considered, there's probably some like attachment piece happening there.
Yes. Yeah. I'm thinking about so many things in practice building where like we talk about how when you build a business, all your buttons are going to get pushed. And that includes all your attachment buttons. Like they're mashed hard.
Oh, yes, very much so, right? Especially in that beginning phase where you're like, does anybody want to come see me? Does anybody, is what I'm doing worthwhile? Am I a valid clinician? Do I know what I'm talking about? Right? Like there's a lot of stuff in there. And I think that it's, I can't help but think about how we all felt when we were in like 7th or 8th grade, right? And we're just like, does anybody want to be my friend? Does anybody, like, all of those things there's this thread, right, throughout our lives, and we're bringing all of those experiences with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I'm thinking too about like, my brain, and I'm like, okay, well, how do we make it actionable? So what are some steps that we can take to be more aware of our attachment style and more secure in our attachment in session? I'm hearing like noticing those like big responses that we have internally. Like that's a great step. What else can we be doing?
Well, I think that this is, and I know we talk about this all the time, like in the therapy world, but having your own therapy or coaching or mentoring or support or whatever feels good for you, whether that's in a group format or, one-on-one, is super important here, because I think that if you are working to be a relational therapist, and I will say that not everybody wants to be or is a relational therapist, but I think that when one of your priorities is focusing on building that relationship and creating a sense of security, you also are going to need some support, because it's not easy, right? And like, you can't help but bring yourself, just like we've been talking about, you can't help but bring yourself and your experiences to your sessions. And sometimes we need that reflection back, right, to make sure that we're showing up with integrity and that we're not inadvertently causing harm. So I think that that's a big piece of this. Like, if you are a relational therapist, you should have a relational therapist, right? That you go see, so that you can also be practicing and be on the receiving end of what it's like to, have that support and have somebody who's working on creating a strong relational foundation and wanting to make sure that they're naming, like we were talking about earlier, the rupture and work on the repair piece. And I think too that, kind of like we've discussed before, that if you're having a strong reaction, or you find yourself saying like, oh my gosh, that client's so needy, or oh my gosh, that client's so distant, like I can't, whatever I do, I can't like bring them in, or they're so erratic, right? Like if you start having those thoughts or feelings, there's probably something going on for you about your own attachment style being triggered, right? So like, I think that there's a big piece of this really is about growing your awareness.
Yeah. I'm thinking about like a pressurized version of all of this. And I'm thinking about like crisis situations with clients and how your own attachment is going to have you responding internally, at least in different ways. And how that client's attachment may be impacting how that all plays out. Can we just like walk through scenarios like that to see what they might look like?
Absolutely. So one of the things, as I heard you talking, I had this moment of thinking about, and this could be its own completely separate conversation, right? So I'm going to try and be very mindful about it. But from my perspective and my understanding of attachment theory and relationships, we have this idea of, for example, like borderline personality disorder, right? And we will have clients who have that very strong sort of like push pull, where we might like see them experiencing crisis a lot, or we might see them, kind of like falling off the grid and we're like, where did they go? Are they okay? Or maybe experiencing, you know, suicidality, or like all, all of these different pieces. And from my perspective as an attachment therapist, that's really coming from this place of attachment, right? Like this understanding of like, oh my gosh, am I loved? Am I accepted? Am I, you know what I mean? Like, do I have a place here? What's this person going to do if I'm sort of, and I say this in quotations, but like if I'm acting out, right? Or if I'm kind of on my, and again, in quotations, like worst behavior, is this person still going to accept me and care about me and want the best for me? Or will I create a reaction or a response in them that feels similar to what I experienced when I was young? And then I play out all the things that happened, right? Where I don't have resources and I don't feel cared for. And I see this often happening in our, like in our therapeutic relationships. And this to me feels like, first of all, an opportunity for us to make sure that we have a wealth of support as clinicians, right? Like if something is happening in a relationship with a client where we're like, ooh, I'm kind of feeling this like yucky tummy feeling or something is going on, right? This is a chance for me to reach out and check in and make sure that I have support and I have someone to bounce ideas off of. I would also encourage you to make sure that those people are relational therapists too, right? Because if they're like, oh my gosh, that person has borderline personality disorder and you need to get out of that relationship with them. And you know what I mean? Like if there's this very quick kind of response to just shut it down, that's probably not the person to be talking to in that moment, right? But to be able to say like, oh, I wonder what's happening for them. Did anything happen in your last session? Or do they have something going on in their personal life that's bringing this up? So being able to kind of step back and give yourself some space to really look at the full picture of what is happening with that client and what's happening with you, right? So like considering, what are my fears here, right? Am I afraid that this person is going to hurt themselves? Am I afraid that they're going to, make some report to the board? Or am I afraid that they're, going to cause me to have a bad reputation in my community or whatever? And be able to kind of make those fears right size and be able to step in as the most secure version of yourself. And that often requires getting support or getting supervision or whatever. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. And I think that it's a good example to use folks with BPD, because I think they're also the most maligned clients in our field most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And, the way that people talk about them so flippantly, when like they've already been through enough. God,
oh my gosh, that's right. Well, and it's really like when we're looking at, like I was saying before, from my perspective, when we're looking at borderline personality disorder, we may actually be looking at disorganized attachment, right? And so, and understanding that there are two conflicting systems at play here, right? Which is the one that wants to be in relationship and needs to be in relationship, and the other that is terrified, right? So like when you have both of those things going on, people's behaviors are going to be erratic. They are going to be unpredictable, and they might feel a little bit scary to somebody, right? Who is like wanting to do their best and wanting to, provide the best support that they can. It can feel a little bit overwhelming, which is why I think it's so important that we have other people around us to support us in checking in about like what we might do in those particular scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also thinking, so I've been working in the eating disorder field for 23 years. And so like I would hope any field, over 23 years, there has been a lot of changes in how we approach treatment, how we care for our people. And I think about like the early span of time in my work in that, there was like a very hard line of, well, if, we have provided the support, we have provided the meal plan. If she is not abiding by the meal plan, then at some point, like, we got to wait until she's ready. We got to just wash our hands of her and she can come back later when she's ready.
Mm-hmm.
And how many, I think, God, it makes me cringe to think about how many people were like, their provider basically terminated treatment. I mean, gave them the, like, you can do what we're telling you to do, or you can leave ultimatum that reinforced a lot of the reasons that they were struggling with an eating disorder in the first place, relationally and in their lives.
Mhm.
It breaks my heart to think about how that was just kind of what we did.
I know.
Um,
Yeah. Well, and that to me is also, that's not that far out of the ballpark in terms of like, no, absolutely not. Like you are paying for this late cancellation, and it doesn't matter to me if you're sick or your kid is sick or you had to pull over on the side of the road and vomit on your way here. Like you are paying for this, right? And it's kind of that thing of like, this is like, I just saw you do this with your hands, right? It's like, it's that thing of like, I'm done, right? Like this is not my problem. And I think that when we are relationally focused, we're able to not take things so personally, right? And we can see that, like, okay, this does belong to you. And how can I provide the support or the scaffolding or the reinforcement that you need so that you can feel like you can navigate this issue,
right,
right? Like, so we're
right.
not just abandoning people, which is one of the main fears, right? That's one of our deepest fears as
Yeah.
humans, is that the people who care about us are going to leave us. And
Mhm.
if we are clinicians who are engaging in that type of behavior, right, we are perpetuating harm, and not intentionally, but it's happening, right?
Mhm.
And again, I would just want to reiterate, having boundaries is very important. And I think that you can support people who are really, really struggling and still have boundaries and keep yourself safe and healthy and all of the things without being harmful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think about the like early aughts eating disorder treatment and how like the anxious attachment perspective of the therapist being like, you got to go, is coming from, I don't feel effective. I'm worried about you, and you're not making the progress that I feel like you should be making based on whatever timeline I'm considering.
Mhm.
In order for you to be healthy and safe, I'm worried about the liability. Like it's about the therapist, right? It's not about the relationship. It's not about the client. It's not about the recovery. And how like the avoidant attachment is like, you're not trying your hardest and like, I'm not doing the work for you kind of a mindset. And then disorganized is probably like what the hell is going on here? I don't know how to fix this
Right.
situation.
Which is kind of like what we were talking about with like borderline personality disorder, right? Which is like you're erratic or you're unpredictable or I don't know what's coming and I feel afraid,
Mhm.
right? So I'm getting out of here. Like I gotta bounce because this is feeling too, it's like feeling too much. And I will say too that I think um that we didn't even mention like the anxious style in that, because as therapists we love the anxious attachment style in therapy,
Right.
right? Because these people are coming to session with a lot to talk about and a lot to share, and they often are more validated in their needs or what's going on for them than the other styles are. And I think that there's something super important in here about us as clinicians. When we have a deep understanding of the different attachment styles, we're able to see what the challenges are around that style as well, because there are challenges, right? Like there are things that people who have that style bring to relationships that can feel really hard. And I think that generally in our culture, we're more accepting of that style than the other ones because we're like, oh yeah, tell me all the things. This person is so open. They're so vulnerable. They're so right. And in therapy, we value those pieces. But those aren't the only things that matter. And how do we sort of balance out or even out how we consider each of the styles so that we're not prioritizing one over the others?
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, I think also having different like theoretical orientations geared towards different presentations, right? Like I think of radically open DBT and DBT, and just having all these different options of ways to work with people, which can also be done from a relational context that allows them to explore the other way. Like that's one of the things I love about RODBT. It's like there's just this opportunity. You don't have to like tell me your whole life story when that's terrifying. You can just tell me about Tuesday, and that's scary enough. So
Mm.
I think there's a certain amount of like giving research time and money and training time and money to not just containing our people who are so overtly having a hard time, but also helping love and support the people who are crumbling inside, but you can barely tell.
That's exactly right. And seeing their worthiness as people, right? And recognizing that their behaviors and ways of coping are an adaptation to their environment, right? So it's like I said before, we come by our styles honestly. And so if you see somebody who tends to shut down or pull away or become distant, there's a reason that's happening, right? And I think that we need to understand that often these things, they're not choices, right? They're things that we do in order to protect ourselves and keep ourselves safe, which is the same as like when someone comes into your office and just verbally vomits everywhere, right? And it's like, that's the same thing. They're doing the same thing, right? They're working to build relationship and connection and feel safe. It's not different really than someone pulling away and shutting down and needing space. So I think that it's really important for us as clinicians to be aware of what those adaptations look like so that we understand that that's what they are, is adaptations and not something else.
Yeah. So this also brings up a struggle that all of us can have because we're all tender in some ways, right? Of like, how can we build and ask for, let me start over. How can we ask for feedback from clients or interpret feedback from clients and build resilience with that? Because I know when we get fired by a client, like, especially if we don't see it coming. I talk to a lot of therapists who have this happen. It's crushing. Like, I remember, I don't see a lot of clients anymore, but I remember what it was like to be fired by a client or to be ghosted by a client. How can we build some resilience with that, with this attachment lens?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I'll say is like, I think regularly asking for feedback or checking in about like, how are our sessions feeling for you? And this can be like a thing you do when someone's like, when you're wrapping up and just being like, hey, this is the thing I do is I just check in, like, how is this feeling for you? I want you to know you can like answer now and we can have a quick conversation. You can email me, you can, right, like whatever, like being able to just offer these different options for folks. Asking for feedback regularly, I think is really important because it then builds a culture of offering feedback in your practice. So people, when you're asking for the feedback, people are then like, oh, now that I have something to share, right? Like I can offer this to my therapist because I know that they want to know. And I think that's another piece of like building security into our practices is like, I know I can offer this and my therapist is going to respond and say, wow, thank you so much for letting me know, and not be like, oh, well, I didn't mean it that way, or I didn't say, you know what I mean? Like you have to be ready for it. And whether that's in that moment on the inside, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so triggered. Like, I don't even know what to do. It's okay to just be like, I really appreciate you offering me this feedback and I'm going to consider it. And we can also have a conversation about it later. Right. So like kind of having your script ready. And then, you can see them out the door. And if you need to cry or you need to do whatever you do, like that's also totally welcome. But I think that that's a big piece. The other thing I'll say about feedback is that I think that when a client feels comfortable offering feedback, that actually does say something about how you're practicing. So even if they're giving you feedback that feels uncomfortable or that you don't feel so great about or you don't feel proud of, the fact that they are willing to give that to you, I think speaks to you showing up in a relational way, right? They're like, oh, this is a person who can hear me. And I think that that is really, really big and that in and of itself can be so healing for clients. So even if their feedback is like, I don't know that this is working or I'm not getting what I need, they're able to come to you and say that, right? And that's, I think, really positive for them. So, and in terms of building resiliency, I think the more feedback we hear, when we recognize that it's going to land across the board, that sometimes we're going to get great feedback and sometimes we're not, I think that is really helpful because then again, it helps us take a little bit of space from it. And it's not like, oh my gosh, does this mean I'm not a good therapist? Or does this mean I'm not a worthy human being? It's like, no, everyone is going to have their opinion that comes from their own relational history, right?
Mhm.
It might be impacted in that way. And if we have been, challenging them to grow and change, they might have they might feel kind of yucky about us sometimes, and that's okay,
Mhm.
right? Like that's all a part of this. And if we can hold that and be present with that, then we are actually doing a beautiful service for our clients.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm thinking of different examples. Like if I have a client who is more avoidantly attached and I ask for feedback and they're like, oh, I kind of hate you right now. I'm like, yes, like, thank you.
Yes, totally, right? Like, yes, I mean, I think that's really big for them to be like, oh, you're so frustrating sometimes, or
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
you're really, I come in here, I just want to hang out, and you're like challenging me, or you're like kind of, that's actually really positive. And if you can do that in an attuned way where you're not way overwhelming somebody, right?
Mhm.
Because if you're just going in and you are running over their boundaries, like their mom did when they were younger, you know what I mean? Like they're not going to hang with you. But if
Right.
you can, hey, I want you to know, I'm going to challenge you a little bit around this, right? I'm going to ask you a question and let's see what happens, right? And it's like I'm here with you. If this feels like too much, I'll step back, right? So it's kind of like we're always sort of doing this dance where we're paying attention and we're noticing,
Mhm.
and we are, like pushing a little bit without it being coercive and without it feeling like traumatizing, right? Like that's a piece of being able to be present without creating harm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think about like my other client, like the majority of my clients are anxiously attached people pleasers, right? So
Mm-hmm.
when they say that really didn't land for me,
Mm-hmm.
or no, it's not that way for me. If I'm like, it sounds like blah, blah, blah. And they're like, Not really. I'm like, we made it.
I know, it's so good. And that's what I mean. Like, I think that when we start to recognize that feedback can be all across the spectrum and we're going to get all kinds of feedback all the time, that's actually really lovely and so freeing for us as therapists, right? Because it's like, okay, cool. You didn't like that. Then what that means is like you were able to share that with me. And that's wonderful. So let's try it again. Right.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for sharing that. And that I think is like, then we have the opportunity to work on repair, right? And like that is one of the fundamental principles of attachment theory, is that we're able to come in, and when there is a rupture, which is like just a part of being in relationship, that we're able to say, okay, that happened, now what do we need to do to move forward together?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And one more kind of thing it makes me think of, which isn't about clients at all, but I remember I went into therapy one day, like with my own therapist, and said, oh yeah, I was at the time really learning to cope with parenting a differently wired kid and having a really hard time because the ways in which she's wired and the ways in which I'm wired are in like complete mismatch. And in that mismatch actually ends up being a really beautiful fit. I just hadn't gotten there yet. But I was like, I feel awful. Like we were like on the stairs and I like said her name really sharply because she was doing X, Y, or Z. And then she just threw her arms around my legs and she was like scared, but holding on to me, the person who had made her scared. And my therapist was like, that's beautiful. And I was like, what are you talking about? It was awful. And she like helped me see that speaks to our attachment.
That's
And that
right.
like I was the safe person in the moment that I created an unsafe situation for her.
Yes, definitely. That's exactly right. And that she felt comfortable, even though that happened, she felt comfortable coming to you. And she knew that by coming to you and like holding onto your leg, that you all would figure it out, right? Like that it didn't mean like, oh my gosh, our relationship is over, that it
Right.
wasn't fragile, right? That there was this strength in what you had already built together that
Mhm.
allowed you to figure it out together. And I think that that is really that's meaningful across the board, right? In all of our relationships.
Mhm. I used to think, and this a training actually just like blew my mind around this, and I'd love for us to end here. I used to think that relationships like you were supposed to be getting it right 90% of the time. Like that was my expectation for myself. I was feeling very generous that I was willing to allow myself to mess up a percentage at all, and repair in there as well. But I thought like, well, 90% of the time you should be really nailing each relationship. Can we talk some about the fallacy of that?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. So, what the research shows in terms of attachment theory and about the percentage of time that we need to be getting it right, being attuned, right, which is like responsive and aware of what's happening for the people that we're in relationship with, in order to have secure attachment, is around 30% of the time, which means that the other 70% of the time, we might be misattuning to something. We might say, oh, so it sounds like your day was really great. And the person is like, no, actually it wasn't. Like the morning was really hard. Right. And we're like, oh, okay. Right. So like, and then we kind of like readjust and we get back on track. Or you might read someone's facial expression and be like, oh my gosh, they're so mad at me. And they're like, no, I actually just, like stubbed my toe. And like, now you know what I mean? Like I was in pain and like that had nothing to do with you. And so being able to understand that, that 30% of the time, and how many of us are doing so much more than 30% of the time, right? Like, I mean, those of us who are aware and doing this work, and I imagine anyone who's listening to this is like in that category. Like we are working really hard to do better than that 30% of the time. But then there are going to be days where we're just kind of scraping by, and that's okay, right? Mm-hmm. Like what we've built prior to that rough day or that rough moment is really what kind of gets us through those times. And then we move forward and we try again. And that's all that we can really do.
Yeah. Yeah. Just knowing I didn't have to be so close to perfect with it. And that sometimes those misattunements aren't just like a gentle misattunement, like misinterpreting something. Sometimes you step in it. Sometimes you say something hurtful. And that's where like repair is so important and profound. And like since that training, I've been looking at how, and this was years ago, like every time I have the opportunity to repair, I watch how much closer we become afterwards.
Yes, absolutely.
Like every time.
It's amazing to me. And that's why I think, especially when we're talking about relationships with our clients, when you think about how many people did not have parents or caregivers or adults in their lives who owned up to what they did or how they screwed up or how they stepped in it or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. To have another person come to them and say, hey, you know what? I was thinking about our last session. And I realized that last thing that I said, I could tell it didn't land for you. And I've been thinking about it since then. I just want you to know I'm really sorry that I hurt your feelings, right? Like that, talk about profound, right? To have that experience where someone is owning how they showed up and being accountable for that in and of itself, I'm telling you, if like you did nothing else, right, in those sessions, that you were accountable to your therapy client and you said something along those lines, you would be making a tremendous difference in their life.
Absolutely. Yeah. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, absolutely. It was wonderful. Oh, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate you.
Absolutely. I appreciate you too. And I'm really excited that people get to learn from you. And hopefully, like, I genuinely encourage people to go to Elizabeth's websites. Like, there's so much good value there. And whether you're kind of old hat with like relational therapy or attachment styles, or you're new to it, you've got some good things to read and learn. So thanks for all you do.
Thank you.
I hope that broadened your clinical horizons. Head over to notboringces.com to get your CE credit. Want to have a not boring conversation with me about your clinical area of expertise? You can apply there too. If you like this conversation, leave us a 5-star review, tell a friend, and be sure to subscribe for future conversations.